What if I told you that in ancient Egypt, the greatest threat inside a sacred temple was not a curse, not a god, not even the wrath of a forgotten deity, but the priests themselves? Imagine stepping barefoot onto the cold limestone floor, carrying your offering with trembling hands, believing you were entering the safest place in the world, and in the next breath, realizing that every move you made, every breath you took, every flicker of doubt in your eyes could mark you as impure. What did the Egyptian priests do to worshippers they deemed unworthy, so unclean, so spiritually tainted, that even the scribes refused to fully record it? The answer is far darker than the hieroglyphs ever admit. Picture the Temple of Karnak before sunrise, columns rising like stone giants, incense drifting in silent spirals, and behind those monumental walls, rituals so secret that only a handful of high priests knew the full sequence. People traveled for miles to seek purification, forgiveness, or healing, but none of them understood the truth. The same priests who blessed them had the power to condemn them. And when they labeled someone impure, the consequences were designed not just to cleanse the spirit, but to break the person. But here is what the official histories never mention. Purity wasn't only spiritual, it was political, social, convenient, a tool, a weapon. The priests guarded their authority with precision, and the impure became their test subjects, their warnings, their living messages. The rituals that followed were crafted to terrify, to reshape, to dominate. And in the shadowed rooms behind the public chambers, the priests performed acts so disturbing that the scribes, men trained to record the deeds of pharaohs and the commands of gods, hesitated to write them down. So ask yourself, why would a civilization obsessed with order, balance, and divine justice allow such darkness to exist beneath its temples? And why did so many worshippers continue to walk willingly into rituals that would strip them of dignity, identity, and sometimes even memory? The truth is simple. Fear is the oldest form of control. And the priests understood fear better than anyone. If what you've heard so far unsettles you, if it shakes the image you thought you had of ancient Egypt, then stay close. Because what comes next dives even deeper into the forbidden chambers the priests swore never to reveal. Before we descend further, tell me, have you ever wondered whether your beliefs, your rituals, or even your trust could be used against you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to hit the like button and check whether you're already subscribed to the channel. What you discover next might surprise you, and the path ahead only grows darker from here. The deeper you move into the temple, the more you realize that nothing inside it was accidental. Every torch, every carved relief, every doorway was part of a hidden system designed to evaluate you long before the gods supposedly did. The priests didn't simply wait for offerings, they studied the worshippers the moment they stepped across the threshold. And what determined whether someone was deemed pure or impure had little to do with moral failings and far more to do with how easily they could be controlled. The classification began subtly. A priest's assistant, usually a young initiate with shaven head and eyes trained to detect hesitation, watched how you carried your offering. Was it with confidence or fear? Did you look directly at the priest, or did your gaze fall to the ground too quickly? Even your scent mattered. The temple had its own coded aromas, lotus oils, incense mixes, resin blends. If you smelled of travel, sweat, or foreign herbs, that alone could trigger suspicion. Impurity became a label tied to anything unpredictable. Once marked, even silently, you were guided to specific areas of the temple complex where the architecture shifted. The corridors became narrower, colder. The air felt denser. You were no longer surrounded by worshippers seeking blessings. Instead, you walked beside others whose eyes darted nervously, people who sensed, without understanding, that they had already been separated from the rest. The priests excelled at this invisible sorting, their movements choreographed with manipulative precision. And then there was the questioning. Not an interrogation, not a conversation. Something far more psychological. A priest would ask about your dreams, your health, the journey that brought you there. But these questions were crafted to expose emotional fractures. A trembling voice, a poorly timed pause, a glance filled with doubt. These subtle cues were enough for the priest to make his judgment. Impurity became a verdict passed not on truth, but on vulnerability. What most worshippers never realized was that the priests were trained like surgeons of the human spirit. They studied body language, learned to manipulate expectation, even memorized patterns of speech to detect insecurity. And beneath the sanctified language of purity, they hid the real objective, identifying those who could be pushed deeper into the system without resistance. To the priests, an impure worshipper wasn't a sinner. They were an opportunity. But nothing was written openly. The scribes recorded only what the temple allowed. Purity decrees were disguised as blessings. Impurity classifications were tucked into margins or omitted entirely. The worshipper believed they were undergoing a sacred evaluation, but the temple was mapping their weaknesses, deciding who would remain in the public eye and who would be funneled into the darker chambers behind the ceremonial halls. Step by step, without realizing it, the impure were led into a spiritual labyrinth built to consume their fear. And once the priests decided your place within this hierarchy, the path ahead narrowed until escape, physical or spiritual, became nearly impossible. The temple did not need chains. It needed obedience, shaped through silence, shadows, and the ancient belief that priests spoke with the voice of the gods themselves. The deeper this system pulled you in, the less you recognized yourself, and the more the priests saw exactly what they needed. Someone ready for the rituals that only the impure ever witnessed. Once a worshipper was marked as impure, the temple's public beauty became a facade, an elaborate mask hiding procedures that only a fraction of the priesthood fully understood. The rituals of purification were spoken about with reverence, wrapped in language that suggested healing, cleansing, renewal. But the truth was far more unnerving. These rites were engineered not to elevate the spirit, but to dismantle resistance, to make the worshipper malleable, compliant, and psychologically exposed. The initiation began with isolation. You were taken to a chamber lit only by a single oil lamp, the flame trembling against. Sandstone walls carved with symbols you couldn't interpret. A low hum filled the room, not from chanting, but from wind funneled through narrow vents, a sound deliberately crafted to unsettle the mind. There was no priest inside with you, only the presence of something unseen, something that made your own thoughts feel louder than they should. After what felt like hours, though sometimes it was only minutes, a priest would enter silently. They never stepped heavily. They moved like shadows, their linen robes barely whispering across the floor. They carried no tools in their hands, at least none you could see, and this absence was intentional. The priests understood that fear of the unknown destabilized people more effectively than any visible instrument. The first stage of purification was sensory manipulation. Some worshippers were deprived of light for extended periods. Others were overwhelmed with bright torches and rapid stimuli. Certain chambers echoed every breath, amplifying the smallest tremor. Others were so silent that your heartbeat became intrusive. The priests used these environments as psychological blades, slicing away certainty, identity, and emotional control. Then came the questioning, not the gentle probing used earlier in the public halls, but something methodical. The priest stood close, so close that the scent of incense on his skin mixed with the dryness of the air. He spoke in a slow, rhythmic cadence, meant to lull the worshipper into confusion. The questions were repetitive, circular, designed to induce doubt. What have you hidden? What stains follow you? What shadow have you brought into the temple? Even when the worshipper insisted innocence, the priest responded with silence, a silence that accused more loudly than words. Some rituals involved water, not in the cleansing, symbolic way seen in other cultures, but in controlled deprivation. You might be offered a bowl you weren't allowed to touch, or watch droplets fall from a vessel, while none were given to you. The priests understood thirst as a kind of spiritual panic, and they wielded it with precision. Touch was rare, but when it occurred, it was unsettling. A hand placed lightly on the back, a finger tracing the collarbone, a palm pressed against the forehead. These gestures were calculated to feel both intimate and authoritative, a physical reminder that your body, and by extension your spirit, was being evaluated inch by inch. But the most disturbing part of the purification ritual was the moment the priest whispered the decree. Not spoken loudly, not recorded officially, but delivered so softly that the worshipper wondered if they had imagined it. The impurity remains. Those words were the key to the entire process, because the rituals were never meant to purify. They were meant to justify whatever came next. The worshipper left those chambers disoriented, drained, certain only of one thing. The priests knew something about them that they themselves could not see. And that manufactured fear, more than any spiritual symbolism, ensured obedience. The temple had not cleansed the impure. It had prepared them for the corridors no ordinary worshipper ever entered, prepared them for the rituals that would strip away the last fragments of resistance, prepared them for the rooms where purification ended and punishment began. Beyond the purification chambers lay corridors that no ordinary worshipper ever saw, passageways carved so deep into the stone that the air grew colder with every step. These were not ceremonial halls, not places adorned with painted reliefs or golden statues. These were the concealed arteries of the temple, the spaces where the priest's true authority unfolded without witnesses, without oversight, without mercy. And for those deemed impure, this was where the ritual facade ended and the real ordeal began. The entrance to these chambers was always disguised. Sometimes behind a painted panel depicting a god, sometimes beneath a platform used for offerings. A priest would guide the impure worshipper forward, often with a hand on the shoulder, not a comforting gesture, but a quiet reinforcement that retreat was impossible. Once the panel slid shut behind them, the worshipper stood in near darkness, illuminated only by a torch whose flame seemed to shrink in the cold draught. Inside, nothing followed the visual order of the temple above. The walls were rough, unfinished, marked with incisions that looked less like decoration and more like frantic scratches. Some were horizontal, others vertical, as if people had once tried to claw their way through the stone. The priests instructed the worshipper to stand at a specific spot. a patch of worn floor where countless others had stood before. The stone there felt smoother, polished by the fear of bodies pressed against it. Then the procedures began. The priests never explained what each action meant. They preferred ambiguity. A bowl of darkened water held beneath the chin, but not offered. A strip of linen wound tightly around the forearm, constricting the flow of blood until numbness spread. A rope lowered from the ceiling, not to bind, but to hover just close enough to imply what could happen. Every gesture served one purpose: destabilize the mind until fear replaced rational thought. The priests whispered invocations in a monotone cadence, not prayers, but commands disguised as prayers. Release what taints you. Let the impurities surface. Do not resist what the gods reveal. The worshipper, trembling, rarely understood the words, but the rhythm itself worked like a psychological net. The priests were not seeking confession. They were seeking surrender. In some chambers, water dripped from the ceiling at irregular intervals, each drop echoing like a heartbeat. In others, a faint vibration pulsed beneath the floor, perhaps from hidden mechanisms, perhaps from the shifting earth itself. Whatever the source, the effect was intentional. The worshipper felt watched, measured, judged by forces beyond human understanding. Sometimes the priest circled the worshipper slowly, their feet silent on the stone. They examined posture, breathing, the twitch of muscles under stress. They studied fear like astronomers studying the stars. And if a worshipper cried, begged, or collapsed, the priests considered it proof not of weakness, but of deeper impurity that required further procedure. The scribes who recorded these events did so reluctantly. They wrote only fragments, vague references, symbols instead of descriptions. Some entries were later scratched out. Others were smeared intentionally. Even the record-keepers feared what occurred in these depths. The worshipper never left these rooms the same. Some emerged hollow-eyed, gripping their garments like shields. Others walked as if balancing on invisible edges. Most spoke little afterward, convinced that the gods, not the priests, had confronted them in the darkness. And that belief was precisely what the priesthood desired. If you have thoughts about the hidden chambers, or if something in this part of the story resonated with you, leave a comment sharing what struck you the most. Your reflections help keep this narrative alive as we continue deeper into the forbidden corridors of this ancient world. The power of the temple extended far beyond its towering pylons and golden altars. The priests, the elite guardians of sacred knowledge, were not only spiritual leaders, they were masters of influence, architects of fear, and conductors of obedience. Their authority depended less on divine command and more on the psychological domination of every worshipper who entered their precincts. The impure were merely the most visible subjects in a meticulously designed system of control. Every public ritual was a stage, every blessing a lesson in hierarchy. The population was trained to witness the priest's authority, to see their ability to elevate or condemn, and to internalize the fear that compliance was survival. Even those who were deemed pure were subtly monitored, their gestures recorded, their expressions studied for signs of doubt. To the priests, the entire community was both congregation and laboratory. The elite clergy operated in concentric layers of secrecy. Only a few hand-picked initiates advanced beyond the inner sanctum, where esoteric knowledge and forbidden rites were preserved. Others performed ceremonial duties, repeating chants and rituals without ever knowing the reasoning behind them. This separation ensured that loyalty was cultivated not only through instruction, but through ignorance. Those who thought themselves observers were, in reality, participants in a vast system of psychological conditioning. Fear and reverence were carefully balanced. Public punishments, though rare, served as theater for obedience. A ritual gone wrong, a misstep in carrying an offering, even a hesitation before a sacred idol could trigger a visible reprimand. The temple walls absorbed these lessons, echoing them to all who dared enter. The priests understood human nature. They knew that the memory of witnessing consequences, even at a distance, instilled a deeper respect and submission than any sermon could. But the true mastery of the religious elite lay in their manipulation of perception. They framed their control as divine necessity. To question the priests was to question the gods themselves. This conflation ensured compliance without physical force. Obedience became a ritual, repeated by every worshipper who feared that impurity could strike at any moment. The line between spiritual devotion and psychological captivity blurred, and in that blur, the priest's power flourished. Even scribes, those who recorded the temple's history, became instruments of control. Their documentation, often intentionally cryptic, served multiple purposes: preserving knowledge, disguising the extent of punishment, and maintaining the aura of inscrutable authority. Few ever understood the true scope of what occurred, and fewer still could challenge it. The priest's dominion over belief, fear, and perception created a population whose devotion was inseparable from subjugation. The hierarchy extended outward, too. Merchants, local officials, and nobles were aware of the temple's reach. Gifts and offerings ensured favor. Neglect or dissent invited scrutiny. Stories of the impure were whispered as cautionary tales, a silent reminder that the temple could touch anyone at any moment. In this system, obedience was not optional. It was survival, encoded into the very structure of belief, maintained through ritual, observation, and the unspoken, relentless presence of the elite clergy. The population's faith, genuine as it may have been, became a currency. Every prayer, every offering, every movement in the temple was measured, interpreted, and recorded. Through this subtle, pervasive psychological control, the priests ensured that the population internalized their authority, obeyed their decrees, and accepted their power as absolute, even when the rituals themselves were unseen, mysterious, and fearsome. The scribes were the invisible backbone of the temple's authority. Trained from childhood in the art of hieroglyphic precision, their hands etched the story of gods, kings, and rituals into stone and papyrus. But behind the ornate, script and ceremonial inscriptions lay something far more sinister: the documentation of the impure, the whispered punishments, and the hidden manipulations no ordinary worshipper would ever know. These records were not mere history. They were instruments of power, codifying fear and obedience for generations to come. Scribes were selected carefully. Only those who demonstrated unwavering loyalty, discretion, and a capacity to internalize the priest's worldview were allowed to record the most secretive rites. They chronicled not only the observable ceremonies but also subtle anomalies: a tremor in a worshipper's hand, the hesitance to touch a sacred object, the fleeting glance that suggested doubt or defiance. Every small sign of imperfection became a mark to be preserved, a warning that could influence future evaluations of impurity. But these records were layered. Public inscriptions glorified the gods, celebrated the pharaoh, and reaffirmed the temple's role as the guardian of cosmic order. Hidden margins, buried scrolls, and coded symbols captured the darker reality. These secret notations detailed the psychological manipulations, the extreme forms of ritual correction, and the fates of those who failed to meet the priest's impossible standards. The scribes' work ensured that even centuries later, the echo of control would endure, long after the victims were gone. The scribes themselves were not free. They understood that knowledge was power, but power carried immense risk. A misrecorded symbol, an improperly concealed event, could provoke the priest's scrutiny. Those who faltered risked reassignment to peripheral duties, exile from the temple, or even subtle forms of punishment designed to erode their loyalty. Every stroke of the stylus was a negotiation between accuracy, secrecy, and survival. In this way, the scribes became both observers and participants in a system that demanded complicity. Through their meticulous documentation, the priests created a hierarchy of memory. Some events were made visible, accessible to the public and the faithful, reinforcing awe and reverence. Others were deliberately obscured, coded in ways that only the initiated could decipher. The scribe's role was to maintain this balance, to ensure that the temple's narrative remained intact, even when the human cost remained invisible. Every line they wrote reinforced authority, silenced dissent, and maintained the illusion of divine necessity. Interestingly, the scribes also functioned as psychological tools. Their presence alone reminded worshippers that every action was observed, every thought potentially recorded. This subtle awareness of surveillance enhanced the priest's control, making fear an internalized companion for those who entered the sacred spaces. The scribes' pens did more than record. They extended the power of the priests into the minds of every faithful soul. In this way, the scribes became a living bridge between the visible rituals of the temple and the invisible mechanisms of control. Without them, the priest's power could not have been maintained with such precision. Their writing transformed ephemeral fear into enduring structure, fleeting hesitation into permanent consequence. In the hidden scrolls and silent inscriptions, the impure found their deeds immortalized, their vulnerabilities catalogued, and the temple's authority guaranteed to endure across generations. The moment a worshipper was deemed disobedient or impure, the temple's tone shifted from ceremonial reverence to calculated severity. Punishments were rarely overt. They were designed for subtle devastation, for psychological impact rather than public spectacle. The priests understood that terror was most effective when invisible, when the afflicted believed it was a divine judgment rather than a human decision. The impure were escorted into chambers no one else could enter, where the walls themselves seemed to echo their guilt. Inside these secret rooms, the priests employed methods as varied as they were disturbing. Some involved extended isolation in near darkness, where a single torch illuminated nothing but your own reflection in the polished stone floor. Time became meaningless. Your mind, untethered from normal reality, began to fracture. Others experienced controlled sensory assaults, sudden gusts of cold air, intermittent sounds of dripping water, or the faint, calculated scent of burning incense, always at precise intervals designed to confuse and disorient. The goal was not harm to the body, but complete psychological submission. Rituals of correction were highly structured. A worshipper might be required to repeat prayers, not for devotion, but as a form of obedience training, each mistake corrected with an almost imperceptible gesture from the priests. A trembling hand, a pause in breath, a downward gaze could trigger further measures. The tightening of bindings, the careful placement of objects to restrict movement, or the whisper of incantations meant to amplify fear. Each action, while subtle, left the person feeling completely stripped of agency. Some punishments were symbolic yet excruciatingly effective. Water withheld, food rationed, or symbolic objects manipulated to signify the weight of spiritual failure. The priests monitored not only the physical reactions, but the inner turmoil, fear, despair, doubt, which they considered far more indicative of impurity than any outward sin. 2. Be impure was to exist under constant evaluation, with each gesture scrutinized, every thought presumed visible. The scribes recorded these punishments in cryptic detail. Marginal notes, coded symbols, and shorthand preserved what the public inscriptions could not. Even within these records, however, the precise nature of the punishments remained veiled, a secret known only to the priests and the initiates who had been trained to interpret them. What we know now comes from fragmentary evidence and the faint traces of ink in hidden scrolls, yet even these hints suggest a level of meticulous cruelty designed to enforce obedience. But the real terror was in what the worshippers internalized. They emerged from these chambers forever changed. Their bodies might appear intact, but the mind had been tested in ways invisible to outsiders. The fear of disobedience became a constant companion, embedded in their consciousness. Each time they returned to public ritual, each offering or prayer carried the memory of what awaited those who strayed. The priest's control extended beyond the temple walls, infiltrating daily life, shaping thought, and guiding behavior with unseen hands. If this part of the temple's shadowy world unsettled you, or if you can imagine the kind of fear that was cultivated in these hidden corridors, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your reactions, and your questions. Your engagement keeps this story alive as we continue exploring the forbidden practices of the Egyptian priests and the impure worshippers they controlled so completely. In the temple, faith and fear were inseparable. The priests understood that devotion alone could be manipulated, reshaped, and weaponized. Every ritual, every offering, every whispered chant was layered with subtle cues designed to condition the worshipper's mind. Obedience became second nature, not because the people believed in the gods more fervently than before, but because the consequences of defiance had been internalized long before a single command was issued. Fear operated as an invisible architecture of power. Worshippers were trained to see the priests not merely as intermediaries to the divine, but as arbiters of survival itself. The boundaries between spiritual guidance and psychological coercion blurred. A hesitant bow, a too quick glance, or even a mispronounced word in prayer could be sufficient to trigger suspicion, the mark of impurity, or a more invasive ritual behind hidden doors. The system relied not on violence alone, but on the anticipation of it, the dread that always preceded action. The priests exploited every dimension of human perception. Sounds in the temple were never random. The echo of footsteps, the cadence of chanting, the rise and fall of drums, all were calibrated to unsettle the mind and reinforce hierarchy. Lighting was manipulated to exaggerate shadows, creating a sense of omnipresence for unseen deities or judging eyes. Even temperature, airflow, and the placement of sacred objects were orchestrated to amplify a worshipper's anxiety. By controlling perception, the priests controlled behavior. Social influence extended the reach of fear outside the temple. Stories of impure worshippers, subtle warnings, or whispered accounts of secret punishments reinforced compliance among the faithful. Families shared tales of disobedience's hidden consequences. Neighbors observed subtle shifts in behavior. Communities became co-enforcers of a system they never fully understood. Fear, once internalized, no longer required active enforcement. It perpetuated itself through shared belief. The priests' understanding of psychology was profound. They cultivated the illusion of choice while limiting the options that could be exercised safely. Worshippers believed they were negotiating their fate with the gods, when in truth they were navigating a meticulously constructed labyrinth of behavioral expectation. Obedience became a ritual in fi de itself, one repeated daily through gestures, prayers, and offerings. Each repetition strengthened the invisible chains of authority. Even the most devout found themselves altered. Faith became inseparable from vigilance. Worshippers prayed not only for spiritual guidance, but for protection from the unseen scrutiny of the priests. The rituals themselves served as both penance and rehearsal for compliance, reinforcing the mental conditioning required to survive. Over time, the line between sacred observance and learned submission disappeared entirely. In this system, rebellion was rare because it carried an internalized weight far heavier than any external punishment. The priests did not need to threaten overtly. The fear they had nurtured inside each worshipper was sufficient to ensure absolute obedience. Every visit to the temple reminded the faithful of the invisible hand shaping their thoughts, their actions, and even their devotion. The control was total, seamless, and frighteningly effective. The temple's hierarchy was a world unto itself, a microcosm where the priests held authority comparable to kings. Every decision, every ritual, and every judgment reinforced the notion that they were the direct voice of the gods. Worshippers entering the sacred precincts did not merely encounter religious ceremony. They entered a domain where human law and divine will were indistinguishable, where questioning the priest was tantamount to questioning eternity itself. Priests wielded power with meticulous precision. They controlled the flow of information, the access to sacred spaces, and the interpretation of rituals. Gods were present only through their intermediaries, and the will of the divine became inseparable from the judgment of the clergy. Impure worshippers were taught to believe that their missteps were not accidental. They were offenses against cosmic order, punishable by forces beyond comprehension. This merging of authority and spirituality ensured that obedience was felt in the mind, body, and spirit alike. Even within the temple, distinctions of rank reinforced control. High priests, robed in the finest linens and adorned with symbols of office, moved silently through the inner sanctum, their presence alone commanding attention. Junior priests, initiates, and scribes performed the visible duties, from chanting to recording, but each action was carefully supervised. Every gesture, every intonation, every interaction carried consequences that extended beyond the temple walls. The population outside internalized these structures, seeing the priests as untouchable arbiters of fate. The connection between the divine and the temple hierarchy was reinforced through ritual spectacle. Ceremonies involving offerings, chants, and processions were designed to elevate the authority of the priests while simultaneously reinforcing the vulnerability of the worshippers. The impure were subtly but powerfully reminded that their position within the sacred order was contingent upon compliance. Each gesture, each step, each word of prayer was measured, recorded, and evaluated. Beyond individual rituals, the priests exercised control over knowledge itself. Sacred texts, scrolls, and hieroglyphic inscriptions contained secrets that only the initiated could interpret. The uninitiated were left with fragmented understanding, fostering dependence, awe, and fear. Even the most observant worshippers could never fully grasp the entirety of the temple's power, and that uncertainty amplified submission. To challenge the priests was to challenge not only tradition, but the hidden truths encoded in the architecture, the records, and the rituals. In the inner chambers, the interplay between fear, reverence, and knowledge created an ecosystem of absolute power. The priests understood that authority rooted in belief was more durable than authority enforced by physical punishment alone. Through subtle manipulation, psychological insight, and precise ritual control, they maintained dominance over every aspect of temple life. The impure were a visible reminder of the consequences of deviation. The scribes silently catalogued obedience and transgression, and the gods, ever present in theory, were enforced by human hands with unparalleled discipline. By merging spiritual authority with calculated observation and psychological control, the priests created a system where faith, fear, and obedience were inseparable. Every worshipper, whether pure or impure, was part of a meticulously orchestrated hierarchy that ensured the temple's power remained absolute, unquestioned, and unchallenged. In this shadowed world of divine mandate and human enforcement, the temple itself became an instrument of total control, shaping thought, behavior, and belief in ways invisible to the uninitiated, yet inescapable to those who entered. By the time a worshipper reached the outer halls of the temple, the lessons of fear, obedience, and surveillance were ingrained. They had experienced the hidden chambers, the subtle manipulations, and the invisible authority that controlled every gesture, every thought, every prayer. But the temple's influence extended far beyond these walls. Its power was not confined to ancient rituals or dusty scrolls. It became a blueprint for absolute control, a model of authority that resonates even today in ways we rarely acknowledge. The final truth of the temple is both chilling and enlightening. The priest's dominion was absolute, not because of divine favor alone, but because they understood the human mind with astonishing clarity. They harnessed fear, reverence, and ritualized obedience to maintain order, creating a system where deviation seemed inconceivable. The impure were the most visible proof of their mastery, yet the same lessons were embedded in the behavior of every worshipper, shaping thoughts, choices, and beliefs long after the rituals concluded. And here is where it becomes truly remarkable. The scribes' records, fragmentary as they are, reveal a meticulous strategy. Measure, observe, influence, and codify. Every act of compliance, every subtle gesture of resistance, every sign of weakness was recorded, catalogued, and used to reinforce authority. The priests did not rely solely on punishment. They relied on memory, anticipation, and the enduring presence of their power in the minds of the faithful. Faith itself became a tool for control, a mechanism that shaped societies without physical enforcement. Yet, there is a human lesson buried in this ancient system. The same principles that allowed the priests to dominate the impure reveal how power, fear, and belief intersect across cultures and eras. It reminds us that obedience often arises not from choice, but from invisible pressures, psychological conditioning, and the manipulation of perceived authority. Understanding this dynamic is not merely academic, it is essential. It teaches us to question what structures influence behavior today, to recognize when trust is exploited, and to discern the subtle ways authority can shape thought and action. So, if you have followed this journey into the hidden chambers, if the story of impure worshippers and secret rituals unsettled or fascinated you, now is the moment to reflect. Leave a comment below to share your thoughts, to say, "I stayed until the end," or to express what struck you the most about the priest's absolute control. Don't forget to hit the like button if this exploration of ancient power resonated with you, and subscribe to the channel so you can continue uncovering the hidden truths history often tries to erase. The past has lessons that stretch far beyond stone walls and incense, lessons that illuminate human nature and the mechanisms of authority in ways still relevant today. And as you absorb these revelations, remember this: the temple may be ancient, the priests long gone, but the strategies they perfected endure in whispers, in behaviors, and in systems we encounter every day. Their shadows are still with us, shaping belief, obedience, and fear in ways subtle and profound. And the deeper you look, the more you realize that understanding these hidden forces is not just about history. It is about seeing the unseen patterns that continue to influence human lives even now.